Hey everybody, so one of the questions we get most at the MHP Pros is, if I'm looking at a property, how do I quickly evaluate it and determine whether or not I should pursue that property further? The first step that we give to people in our course and are giving to you now for free is the 5-minute MHP Evaluator. And what I think is great about this tool is that it gives you a quick summary of the potential that that park has and based on its current price, whether or not it would be worth pursuing that park. So let's dive into how to use it. And the first thing you would need, obviously, is a deal. And so I already have some inputs from a deal that I am pursuing in the evaluator. And what we'll do here is kind of walk through how I arrived at each of these individual inputs. So the first one being our lot rent. Lot rent is easy to find. Lot rent is usually one of the first things listed on any mobile home park listing website, whether that be Crexy or LoopNet, or if you got an offering memorandum from a broker, or you're looking at a Facebook posting, whatever the case may be. Usually, lot rent will be one of the first things mentioned because it is so important as an input into any model in understanding what the profitability will be. The next thing, obviously, that will be listed is what's the size of the park. So, in this case, it's a 27 lot park. The occupied lots, how many of those lots are actually filled with a home, and how many of those homes are filled with tenants or have actually been sold to a tenant? That's also an important input. So when we look at occupied lots here, we're not just talking about physical occupancy, but rather if it's revenue occupied, meaning is there actually someone inside that paying you the lot rent? Important distinction, right? So here we have the occupied lots. There's 26 lots. They're all occupied. They all have tenants inside of them of the 27 total. So what's the expense ratio? And this one is not very hard. Sometimes it can trip people up, but all that it is, if we pull up what the expenses of the park are, what the income and expenses of the park are, which we have here, is your total expenses divided by your total income. We can just do round numbers here. 225 is your income and 126 are your expenses, or 127. If you do equals 127 divided by 225, what you're going to get is 56%. So yeah, then you would just drop that 56% into the expense ratio portion. And obviously the purchase price is going to be another input that's fairly obvious, right? It's going to be on the face of really any listing that you find is going to be the purchase price. Generally speaking, sometimes they may ask for offers. They may ask you to tell them what it's worth, and then they're going to take bids, and then the best and final bid is going to be the one that gets the park. That's not as often as it used to be when you were in a seller's market. Right now we're in a bit of a buyer's market because there are so few buyers who can enter the space in the current interest rate environment. In any case, what that means is that we were given the purchase price of 1.25. So now we're going to determine our stabilization input. So we've determined day one inputs. That's when we buy the park, what are those inputs going to be? But now we want to know, upon stabilization of the asset, meaning when we fix all the problems that are occurring at that asset, assuming that there are some, what are our inputs going to be then? That could include increased rent because rent is way below market. It can include a decrease in the expense ratio because they're overspending because they've neglected the park potentially, or that they haven't been keeping up with the vendors that they previously had. Whatever the case may be, that's what happens upon stabilization of an asset, is that we're going to now be able to increase the profitability of the park. And so this is the section where we're going to be putting that together. So the first input here is going to be your lot rent. And hopefully it's higher than the existing lot rent, right? Hopefully that there's some upside potential that you can extract from the lot rent to bring it to a fair market rent. Again, we are saying fair market rent. What is fair for that area? You're not overcharging people in affordable housing for the homes that they're living in. And so we want to determine what that fair market rent is going to be, and we can do that in a number of ways. And one of the easiest ways to do that would just be by going to the HUD website, which I've linked here. So this will give you the fair market rents for any state and any county within that state. So I'm just going to select one, and now we see that the 2-bedroom and 3-bedroom rents right here for 2024 fair market rents are between 1.7 and 2.1. Okay, so 2,100 to 1,700 is the range for 2 bedrooms and 3 bedrooms. When you dig more into your due diligence, you're going to want to find out exactly what the 2-bedroom, 3-bedroom makeup is of your park, and maybe choose something closer to that range or do a weighted average. And we will actually show you this in our course, how to do a market study and really determine what rents are. However, in the meantime, when you're just doing these quick analyses, we want to just find out what they should be. And so what we'll do is we'll just take the combination of 2-bedroom, 3-bedroom rents, and we'll drop them in here. And then we'll do an average. And what we come to is 1946. Now we're going to take half of that. We're going to get 973. Okay, so let's put 973 in here. Now we have what our potential lot rent is. What we'll see here is that we are actually 44% below fair market rent right now. Our mark to market, our rent mark to market is 44%. So that's pretty great. That means that there's a lot of room to go just to get to fair market rent. And we're going to assume that we're going to occupy that last lot upon stabilization. So we'll bring in one home. Our expense ratio, we're going to say that it's going to drop from 56% to 50%. So only a 6% drop in our expense ratio. We're not super confident that based on the fact that this park is on well and septic that we can really drive down those expenses as far as we'd like to, right? Some parks, city water and sewer, they'll operate on 25% expense ratios, but we're not going to be able to quite get there because we're operating on well and septic. So we have a modest decrease in our expense ratio here. So now we've covered expense ratio. So the next input is how many years is it going to take for us to stabilize this park? Again, it really depends on so many confluence of factors, but we want to understand when we can get to that rent and when we can get to that expense ratio. We're not going that far from the expense ratio standpoint. We're only dropping from 56 to 50, but our lot rent has a long way to go. So I'm going to go on the higher end. It could be anywhere between 2 and 5 years to stabilization. I'm going to go closer to 4 years so that it takes some time for us to raise those rents to where they really should be. And so that's going to be our years to stabilize. We're going to assume 4 years. The next inputs are going to be a little bit more difficult to quantify. However, a good rule of thumb is that your per lot sales price should be at or below your lot rent times 100. So what does that mean? It means that if we take our lot rent, which is $973, and we multiply it by 100, what we get is $97,000 per pad. And if we have $97,000 per pad as the baseline, we want to be at or below that on our per lot sales price. There's a lot of other factors that go into this, however. We need to understand what kind of market we're in. Are we primary, secondary, or tertiary market? What's the quality of the park that we're selling? Is it a piece of garbage or is it a beautiful park? And then finally, one of the factors could be the size of the park. If the park is bigger, there's economies of scale there. And what that means is that the expenses related to the park's operations can be dispersed amongst a larger number of sites, and therefore you're decreasing your expense ratio potentially. So maybe they're willing to pay a little bit more for a park like that. So using that general rule of thumb, we're going to go with about 80,000 a site. Okay? And this could be a little too low, a little too high. I don't know because we're not that deep into this process yet. However, we'll refine that assumption as we put the park under contract and start to understand the operations a bit more and what the market looks like in that area. So your exit cap rate's a little bit more of a complex valuation concept that is sort of outside of the scope of this specific video, but effectively what it means is the inverse of a multiple of NOI. And so what that means is we're going to find out what our NOI is upon stabilization, and then we're going to divide that NOI by 8%, and that will help us arrive at our stabilized property value. So this is what we think that a buyer would be willing to pay for our property. What I've done here is I've looked at the capitalization rate upon entry at 7.4%, and I've conservatively underwritten the exit cap at 8%, which is actually an expansion of the exit cap by 60 basis points. So this is a conservative underwriting approach. But based on my understanding of this park and the underlying levers of real estate, that's what I'm going to input here for the exit cap rate. If you want to learn more about exit cap rates and how they're determined, what they mean, what levers affect them, etc., then I encourage you to take our course, which dives into these more complex finance concepts. However, for now, let's really just take the per lot sales price, and using that will determine what we think the stabilized value of this park is. So moving on from the stabilization inputs, let's go to the financing inputs. We have LTV, which is loan to value. Our loan to value is going to be 75%, which means for every dollar that we spend on this park, the bank's going to give us 75% of that, so 75 cents on the dollar. Our loan amount is going to be based on what the purchase price is times our LTV, so we're going to get $937,000 from the bank, and our down payment is going to be $312,000. Our interest rate is going to be 7.5%. As we know, interest rates are high right now, so this is not going to be super favorable for us from a debt service standpoint. Amortization for mobile home parks usually going to be around 20 years. Interest only. This is usually reserved for larger loans for institutions, although sometimes you can get some interest only, which means you're only paying the interest and not paying back the principal on that loan. We're going to assume that you're not getting interest only here, so 0 years of interest only debt service. It is calculated here just in case you do get that option. This is just principal and interest. This is your regular debt service that you're going to be paying annually, assuming no interest only. So those are our financing assumptions. Now let's move down to our acquisition costs. And we can assume that our closing costs are going to be anywhere between $20,000 and $30,000. Really depends on the size of the deal. The larger the deal is, the more you're going to have to spend on those closing costs, or some of the surveys you have to do, or plumbers you might have to call, or these people who are going to do these inspections to make sure that you're uncovering any of the underlying risks of any given park. So we're going to assume $25,000. This is a smaller park, and so we'll assume a smaller closing cost. Our holding period CapEx, that's how much we think we're going to have to spend throughout the life of this asset. And again, this is really asset specific. So I would just assume that if you need to fill a home, you're going to spend at least $100,000 with site prep, purchasing the home. You might not be able to sell it right away. However, if you do, great, you might get some of that money back. Let's just assume $100,000 for the home that we need to place. Then I put an additional $150,000 for any tree trimming, maybe some road repairs, maybe some well and septic repairs. It could be more than this, it could be less than this. We're also going to be helped out by some of our cash flow, which we're going to push off to the side and ensure that we can pay some of these recurring maintenance costs out of our P&L, or at least out of our leftover cash flow. But we're going to have a reserve, right? We want to have a reserve of capital so that we know if something goes wrong, we have the capital to place it. So I'm putting $250,000 here, which I think for a small park like this, where I need to fill a single lot, that's probably about right. The broker fee, if we need to pay someone who maybe found this deal for us and is handing it off to us, maybe that's 1%. Maybe that's 1% of the deal's value. So this times 1%. Okay, so maybe we have to pay $12,500 to whoever found us the deal. And then maybe we want to take an underwriting fee for our work on underwriting the deal. So we're going to add an extra $5,000, okay, to pay ourselves for all the work we've done. Now, let's look through the outputs, because that's where it's the most important, right? Generally speaking, you'd be kind of going back and forth as you were filling this out to look at the outputs. But we did all the inputs first so that now we can look at the outputs holistically together. Our gross revenue is going to be $211,000. Our expenses, based on our expense ratio, is going to be 56% of that, which is going to leave us with $92,000 left over. Our debt service, which is the amount of money we have to pay the bank, is going to be $90,000 a year, which gets us to $2,300 in cash flow annually, which doesn't look very good. Our cap rate is 7.5%, our cash on cash return is 0.4%, and our debt service coverage ratio, or debt coverage ratio, is 1.03. And the reason that's red is because it's not over 1.2. Generally, a bank's going to look unfavorably upon this deal because it's too expensive to cover 1.2 times what your debt is. So what that means is if we look at our debt service, we need at least 2, and let's do negative so that it comes up positive. We need at least $108,000 of net operating income in order to meet what the bank kind of requires. And so we're about $16,000 shy of that. So we'll come back to that. But right now it's not looking like the deal is going to cash flow in a way where we can get the bank funding we need. So let's move on to the stabilization performance. We see a per lot purchase price of $46,000, which for a lot rent of $677 is actually pretty good, right? Because going back to what we talked about here, where we kind of did our lot rent times 100 and then compared it to our per lot sales price. Our lot rent times 100 is a lot higher than this per lot sales price. So this might be a good deal for a buyer. So we're gonna do the same thing here. We're gonna compare this per lot sales price to the lot rent times 100. What we see is that our lot rent is yielding a much higher value than this per lot purchase price. So it might be a good idea to get this thing under contract. So that means that on paper, this deal looks good because our multiple is higher than the per lot purchase price. However, as we saw earlier, that doesn't necessarily mean much if our expense ratio is too high and our debt service is too high. Let's move along. So our stabilization performance, we performed all the things we said we were going to do. We've increased the lot rent, we've decreased the expense ratio, and so now we have $157,000 annually of income. Our yearly debt is the same as it was, $90,000 a year, and now we have cash flow of $66,000 a year, which is a 11.1% cash on cash return annually and covers our debt 1.74 times. Pretty good, right? If we were able to accomplish this stabilization, we're looking pretty good. We got 12% of cash flow every year, and we're more than covering our debt. So now we know the performance upon stabilization and the in-place performance. Let's take a look at what happens when we sell that property. On a per pad basis, we said we were going to sell for $80,000 per pad. And that yields us a 2.1 million sale price. That means that we've created $910,000 worth of equity. Every year we've created $227,000 worth of equity. Our cap rate here is 7.3%, which is right around where we purchased it. So, that's not a bad assumption. Our multiple is 1.73, nearing 2 in 4 years. That's pretty good. Our equity multiple is 1.5. Again, I'm going to ignore the exit cap valuation here, and we'll talk more about that within the course. So, should we buy this deal? It's a good question. I don't think you'll be able to buy the deal, and that is mainly because of this debt service coverage ratio. No bank is going to want to touch this because you're too close to not being able to pay them. You barely cover the debt service, and that's why we're only cash flowing $2,300 a year, and our cash on cash returns like 0.4% in year one. So in this case, I don't think you can offer the full purchase price for this park. And so here's where this gets fun, because now you can play around with these inputs and determine what you can pay for the park. So let's say we pay $1 million. Well, now our debt service coverage ratio goes into the green. Our cash on cash return is starting to look a little bit more attractive. This is starting to look a little bit more attractive to the bank, and now we may be able to push this through. So how high can we go before this breaks? Let's look at 1.1. Okay, still a little too high, 1,075. And that's really where it needs to be, is at 1,025. That's really the most you can pay for this park right now with these inputs. And that gets you to your 125, which is what the bank's gonna wanna see from a debt service coverage ratio standpoint. And so now we're gonna send our LOI knowing these values for 1,025. And we're gonna try and get it under contract for that price. Now you may not be able to because the seller is dead set on 1,250. However, it'd be best if you can talk to the seller and kind of walk through these calculations with him and say, this is the reason I'm suggesting this amount. It's not because I want to undercut you. It's because that's what the value of the park is with the current interest rate environment and the expense ratio that your park is currently running at. And he might then allow you to put the park under contract. So these are the things you need to do before your LOI. You need to act quickly. You need to do these quick valuations to determine if it's even worth your time to dive in and do all the due diligence required in an actual acquisition. I hope this was helpful. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us at info@themhppros.com. We also really encourage you to buy our introductory course or our 30-day mobile home park course, both of which are going to be linked below this video. You're more than welcome to take those courses, which will really help you understand these inputs more, will help you pass the LOI phase. How are you going to do the actual due diligence? What's your strategy long term? What are the things you need to think about when you start to build a portfolio? These are all questions we answer within the course, and I think it's super important that as a well-rounded real estate investor and a well-rounded mobile home park investor, you start taking your education seriously so that you can learn how to do things like this, right? This is just one tool that we use to help our students. So hopefully this was helpful. Really looking forward to seeing you in our community and as part of our course. Have a great day, everybody.